We are all a work in progress, especially when it comes to our careers. As a student myself, I know the path ahead is not always clear, and that's what makes it yours to shape. I'm Jay, and this is Careers in Progress, where I chat to people across industry, alumni, and the world of work to break down how careers actually come together so you can feel more confident shaping your own path. Not all psychology path leads to a therapy room, and today's episode is here to show you why that's a positive thing. When most people hear psychology, they instantly think of clinical psychologists. But the reality is, it can take you into so many different directions and career pathways. Today's episode will explore what that could really look like. I'm joined by Candice Lester, who is an organizational psychologist, transformation leader, entrepreneur, and director at Capgemini Invent. Candice has worked across organizations like EY and Apple, while also building her own business, Wild Mingo. Candice, it's my absolute pleasure to be welcoming you here in the studio today. How are you?
Thanks, Jay. I'm really well, and it's a privilege to be here. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you so much. I would love to start this podcast episode by asking you a slightly different question.
Sure.
Please enlighten me with something that feels like a work in progress in your life or career right now.
I think it's around the pursuit of proper balance in my life and career. I do a lot of things with work, with the business, Wild Mingo, and then also with home. I have a 2-year-old, so that keeps me incredibly on my toes, and around figuring out how to compartmentalize and feel like I'm giving enough to everything but also not overstretching in any area. That's always been a little bit of a challenge, but I think it's extra challenging as you add more and more to load as you get older, particularly with family. And so it's about reminding myself which things are really important at what times to focus in on.
That is so good. The fact that you've been able to give equal time to everything that is needed is...
Sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
There's a good analogy about in life you have things that are rubber balls and things that are glass balls, and you have to choose which ones you want to keep up in the air, and usually it's the glass ones. Family stuff is always the one you want to prioritize. Health is what you want to prioritize too. And then sometimes there's moments in career, I think, that feel like they're the glass balls, but actually they're rubber. And if it kind of got a little out of hand, it would be okay to bounce back up eventually, but maybe doesn't feel right. So it's just getting comfy to, knowing that it doesn't always feel great when you're not able to juggle everything, but that's okay too.
That's so cool. Now, so much we need to unpack together today, but I would love to go right back at the beginning. What I found out from a bit of a LinkedIn stalk and what I could find on the internet. Your path into psychology wasn't pretty straightforward. Can you take me back to those early days and how you find yourself in this space now?
Absolutely. So when I finished school, I had actually done psychology in year 11 and 12. And I went into university thinking I never wanted to be a psychologist, which is weird because, here we are. But it's because I only knew about clinical psychologists and maybe a little bit around educational or developmental psychs. And that didn't really float my boat. And it wasn't until I was at university and I realised that there were some other opportunities and angles. So I stumbled across an elective for organisational psychology at the same time as I did a commerce elective under organisational behaviour. And all of a sudden I had this kind of micro at the people lens and then macro at an organisational lens, understanding of how people operated within a work environment. And that unlocked a little bit of curiosity in me. So I actually hadn't done the right levels of kind of first, second year studies to be able to kind of go through the psychology path. So I actually had to go back and pick up a couple of different subjects to really pursue that. But I think it was also something that I then realised I was starting to enjoy the learning from a curiosity place and not just because I was trying to tick the box on my kind of academic transcript. And so it was through that I then kind of was encouraged to continue, went through my honours year as a psychologist and then also went into masters. And I remember starting my masters at Deakin and sitting in the room with my fabulous counterparts and kind of waiting for somebody to knock on the door and tell me that they'd made a big mistake, but also equally being so excited by what I was getting to study and sort of feeling like it was the first time in my academic career where I was really enjoying what I was learning, having to do mountains of reading and having, huge amounts of assignments and sort of things due all the time wasn't as stressful as it had been in undergrad and in honours year. It was actually learning I was really excited about, and I was happy to read the extra chapters and the extra, components of the what was set out each week, and found myself wanting to consume more and more information, which probably was a good signal that I was on the right track.
Right. So just as I have my facts right, what was your undergraduate and your postgraduate majors were?
So my undergraduate was a Bachelor of Science. So I started university thinking that I was going to have a career as a dance therapist. I grew up doing lots of dancing through kind of my early teen and then kind of early adult life. And a dance therapist, the type I wanted to be anyway, was to go and work with a really major ballet company somewhere across the globe and kind of be their combined physio, nutritionist, dietitian, sports therapist. And I realised that, I think I must have been in about first or second year, I realised that the type of job I wanted, there were about 6 of them in the entire world. And I'm incredibly ambitious, but I'm also somewhat realistic. And I started to think about maybe that wouldn't be the most immediate pathway to take, and got thinking about what else I might want to do. And it was honestly that time that I stumbled across those 2 subjects in the org behaviour and the org psych electives. And I had also, in my first year of uni, I'd also been given a dean's letter for my psychology subject, which I didn't really pay a lot of attention to. But the letter, essentially, they send it out if you've done really well in the subject. And so they had sort of suggested that I think about that as a major. And I ignored that, again, because it was preposterous to me to be a clinical psychologist. But really what was happening for me there was I knew that I wouldn't be happy in my career if I couldn't have influence and impact. And so much of when you're dealing with somebody who is suffering from mental health issues or other things, you may not be able to help them as much as you try and as much as you kind of create solutions. And I would personally find that really, really difficult. So hence my kind of retreat from psychology. When I found organisational psych as a construct, it was a lot easier to understand how an organisation maybe wouldn't take your advice or wouldn't be able to kind of get well, I guess. That made it a lot easier to reconcile, being able to apply principles around human behaviour that I actually do really enjoy, but into a very different kind of angle and opportunity. And so then when I finished my undergraduate degree, I had a major in psychology and then a minor in biology and then honours in psych, and then I went into my master's of industrial and organisational psychology.
Right. So I would love to lean into the fact that you realized clinical psychology wasn't the best possible path for you. It didn't fit you right personally. Now, how did you come to the realization so early when you were balancing so many things out? What was that something sparked you that you said, I'm doing it, but it might not be for me?
It's a great question, Jay. It's a bit personal, actually. When I was in high school, late high school, one of my very good friends was unfortunately suffering from quite significant mental illness and eventually was diagnosed with depression, but also bipolar disorder. And for a long period of time, I was one of the only people in her life that knew about that. And she was hospitalised at various points as well. So I kind of saw what happens from a clinical psychology system playing out for an individual who, really wasn't able at that time to have the capacity to get well. And I think in having that experience and also kind of understanding the principles of clinical psychology, I probably just reflected on my maybe feelings of frustration or challenge of not being able to have an impact on somebody I cared really deeply about. As a result, as I got a little bit older and was sort of reflecting on that and thinking about it, it was probably why I retreated from the construct of a more kind of one-to-one psychology relationship, an environment like you find in clinical. What I always enjoyed was human behaviour. I love asking why questions. I'm a naturally curious person. And so I think when you go to university, you don't always think about your degree being something that trains you how to think. You think about what the degree is going to lead to in terms of job. And I had that realization, I think it was maybe my first or second year of undergrad, that my degree was actually going to challenge my brain and how I want to think, not necessarily who or what I was going to be. And that flipped a little switch for me. And if I was thinking about how I want to think, there's a lot of principles in psychology that I really align to and subscribe to. I love asking why questions. I'm really comfortable when things are ambiguous and I'm playing in grey space, and you don't get that from other qualifications. If you're studying engineering, you are very much taught to be a black and white thinker predominantly, and you need that for the type of qualification and degree that it is. And so, yeah, it was a little bit of that time and space from a reflection perspective, and also equally, yeah, coupled with some of that personal experience. For that individual, she did eventually get well, which was lovely to see, but equally that took a lot of time, care, and, varying levels of support that was needed. And I think for me, really reflecting on that, knowing that I maybe would have someone in my care that perhaps wouldn't be a positive news story at the end, I would just personally feel like I was failing in that. And that was sort of one of the drivers to say, I need to think about this differently.
Right. So what I've gathered from your answer is, I think having self-awareness is very important for anybody who is in the psychology industry. Is it correct, or am I getting it?
Yeah, I think being somewhat self-aware as to why you're doing any degree, psychology or other, is really, really important. And I think when you're reflecting on what you're studying at university, it's really, as I said, it's about thinking about how you like to think and how does your brain like to think, and, is it comfortable playing in ambiguity and kind of grey space to solve complex problems? Or is it looking for a really kind of defined answer? And I used the example of engineering before, but law is much the same. There's a lot of black and white, and there's a little bit of grey in there too. But again, it's thinking about how do you actually like to solve problems, and how do you like to kind of do puzzles or not do puzzles, depending on what your thing is.
So, Candice, I know as a student myself, there's often a pressure to force ourselves down the expected pathway. And it goes regardless of, what area you've studied, what degree you're enrolled in. So when we talk about your career here, was there any fear around stepping away from the traditional version of success?
I don't think I looked at it as fear. I sort of looked at it more as opportunity and being able to kind of help unlock a different area and career path of what psychology could be for people, and including for myself. I think the risk that comes with, and it was even prevalent in a conversation I had this morning, is it's a newer area for a lot of people to understand. Even though it's been around a long time, it's just probably not as visible for a lot of people. And so having to explain what I do is a regular occurrence even now, a decade and a bit later after kind of studying. And I think that's probably the difference, is that I spend more time kind of trying to help people understand what the role of an organisational psychologist is. And only in the last couple of years have I kind of, seen people in conversations, in both corporate and, also like the dinner party chat, where I can say, I'm an organisational psychologist, and they go, oh, I know what that is, but it's very, very rare. So my hope is eventually that's a less rare occurrence and people just kind of accept and move on. But it is still kind of a newer consideration. And so, yes, lots of questions about whether I actually organise things as an individual, and, all sorts of curiosity about what that actually means for people.
For the people listening to this podcast who might not understand, if you have to brief it up in the simplest way possible, who is an organisational psychologist?
So an organisational psychologist is somebody who is looking at corporate or organisational complex challenges. So they look at how individuals operate within the organisation, but actually how the organisation operates within the context of individuals and teams. I do a lot of work thinking about what the skills are for an organisation and understanding what might make them sustainable or profitable, or, entering into new territories over their next couple of years in strategy. And so that translates to who are the right people to have within those businesses, or what are the areas we might need to teach people about from a skill-based perspective. We also do a lot of work in thinking about what are the kind of traditional mechanisms within organisations that are highly operational. So a lot of the kind of human resource or HR elements, how can they be considered a little bit more strategic to really optimise an organisation to unlock its strategy. And for me, with my previous experience, I have a lot of experience, you mentioned, as well with Apple, so a lot around how that plays out with customer. And so always thinking about how the individual is operating in terms of maybe the consumer that is consuming from that company that I might be working for or contracted to, but actually also how employees are consumers of the organisations that they work within.
I know a couple of friends of mine. My best friend's doing psychology. And whenever she mentions the word psychology, my brain has a default setting that just goes to therapy rooms, consulting, and all sorts of things. But people do not realize that the industry is quite broad. You can do so much with this particular degree. Now, for students who are early in their studies at the moment, do you think there's value in exploring those wider career pathways from the beginning?
I think for anybody who is a young person studying these days, being curious is one of the best skills you can have. I think the rise of AI and other things within a professional world means that our thinking can get a little bit more constrained than I would love to see. And so, particularly within the psychology realm, I'd love people to be understanding what exists and what's out there. I wish some of that stuff was a little bit more visible. It probably wouldn't have taken me to halfway through my second year of my undergrad to then find it. I think starting out, just even knowing and not knowing where you want to get to or what that looks like yet, but just having a little bit of kind of boundless curiosity about what the paths might look and feel like. There are so many different types of psychologists and opportunities, and I reflect on some of my friends and people in my network that are wonderful psychologists in varying practices. A wonderful dear friend of mine who I worked with in a corporate setting. She actually went back and retrained as a neuropsychologist and now works in the prison system. So a very, very different career path, and she runs assessments for those with, brain injuries and often kind of drug and alcohol affected individuals. So super different individual. Somebody then actually did my master's with, has spent a lot of time working in employee assistance and rehabilitation for people, vastly different to the work that I do every day within corporate organisations, and also equally, so consulting and internal. And another has gone into a realm of more one-on-one coaching and counselling and supporting people who might be experiencing mental health or burnout at work. The last two I mentioned, we all have the exact same qualification. So even on the qualifications front and the sort of specialisation within the studies, the career pathing is really kind of broad, and you get the ability to craft from that what you'd like, which I think is a bit of a special thing. It doesn't always happen when you have a bit more of a structured or traditional degree.
Right. For any university student, what do you think they can get more information about if they want to find out more career pathways? So as a potential university student, where can I look up to for more information?
I'd be looking at the different specialisations within what's on offer in psychology. I'd also be going to the Australian Psychological Society website, and also equally the Australian Practitioner Health Regulation Agency website, so APRA. Both of those are going to give really broad explanations about what the art of the possible is, what the pathways to get there might look and feel like. And actually, both of them will offer suggestions into communities of practice within the psychology landscape too, where people can go to events and actually just learn. And I'm pretty sure there's student pricing still, or at least they used to be. So that's always nice too, just to be able to give people the space to explore and to connect. The other thing I'd also encourage students and young budding psychologists to do is, if they've done their research, there is nothing stopping them reaching out either on LinkedIn or via a connection to somebody that they know that works in the industry. We love talking about what we get to do every day, and I certainly love it when students ask me really thought out and crafted questions. And I'm always happy to have a career conversation with somebody who's thinking about what their path might look like. So many of my kind of psychologist peers are in exactly the same position. So we like to share where your career can take you, because it is different for each of us.
Candice, on the flip side, for students who may be considering a career outside the traditional psychology pathway, as we've spoken about, do you have any examples of what that could really look like?
I certainly do. I've got a couple of people that I studied with that do very different things than a traditional kind of psychology and organisational psychology qualification. One of my dear friends, we travelled through our undergrad and our honours year together, and she's actually now a speech pathologist. So she had all the groundings for psychology and decided that pathway around registration and becoming kind of a full-blown psychologist wasn't for her. But what she really enjoyed was the educational and developmental components, and so she went and then furthered her studies and actually became a speech path and works in the hospital system with young kids, so a paediatric speech pathologist. Another individual who I studied with when we did our masters actually at Deakin in Org Psych, she has gone and retrained as a graphic designer and a graphic illustrator. So she went through all of her phenomenal psychology qualification. She worked in that for a little while, and she realised that it wasn't bringing her as much joy as she would have hoped, and she was really creative. So she went and did a little bit more study, and she now actually works as a graphic designer, and she designs a lot of like custom wedding invitations. So a very different kind of premise. And then another that I'll mention is someone who I also did my master's with, and she has gone and started up a couple of different businesses, some very directly in relation to psychology, but most recently she's written some children's books as well. So kind of different again. And I guess I could use myself as an example,
Of course.
in the context of running and starting and running my own business with Wild Mingo. That for me was a way in which I could leverage what I understood about the way humans behaved in the context of consumer behavior, but also colour psychology, along with a whole lot of other things around problem solving and kind of saving the planet that go into it. But not exactly a traditional place you would find a registered psychologist playing in terms of entrepreneurship and setting up an entire product business that runs both in Australia and globally as well.
I can totally see by the flamboyance of the outfit that color is definitely a big part of the identity here.
Yes.
So for students who are still in university pursuing their qualification, and as they say, they want to do more with their degree. So as when they graduate, they have like more employment chances. What do you think are like some top skills? I know it can vary from industry to skills, but from your own expertise, what are some top skills that any psych students must have once they graduate?
I think psychology students are really, really good at gaining a whole lot of data and then, translating that. But I think for what sets you up really well professionally is the ability to translate that into an insight around what does that really mean, that data, not just playing back the information. And I think that's a real differentiator for early career, students stepping into professional work, for the first time. That's definitely something that's unique. I think genuine curiosity as you step into working professionally and sort of being comfortable that whilst your academic studies are teaching you all of the incredible theory that is out there within the areas of practice and the studies that you're taking, putting that learning into practice professionally is actually a new skill, and being comfortable to get curious about how other people do that and how they learn through that, and also appreciating that you're not always going to get it right straight out of university, and that's actually a really important part of working professionally as well. And so being comfortable a little bit, I guess, with the uncomfortable. The third one I would always encourage, and I think university studies naturally help students do this, but we love seeing more of it, and I certainly love seeing more of it when I bring early career talent into the organisations that I work within, is how you ask good questions. Thinking about the types of work that you might be needing to do, or the way somebody's asking you for something, and asking them the questions that are really going to help you actually get to the outcome and actually get to the delivery as well. So spending a little bit of time reflecting on what some good questions might be to actually help you get the outcome you need.
That advice is pure gold. Now, moving on, many students are drawn to the psychology pathway based on their personal experiences. So on one side, they have, yes, as a student, I want to be a psychologist. I want to give it back to the community. I want to help people out. Mm-hmm. And on the other side, you have the thought that you still want to make practical career decisions. It's not about good or bad, but about how you navigate. So from your own experience, for the psych students who are listening to us, how can they navigate this idea and coming to the fact they need to make practical career decision out of this?
I think it's about realising that we spend so much of our time at work, Jay, and we're in our adult life, and you really need to find something that you enjoy. It's still always going to be work. You don't have to love it every day, but you have to want to be interested, I think, in what you're doing if you're going to spend, 40-something hours at least a week doing it for quite some time. And for those students that are thinking about it from personal experience, and of course I've sort of shared a little bit of my personal experience around what led me to decisions around organisational versus clinical psychology, but I think there's often the element around wanting to help people, as you rightly called out, and I think psychologists are kind of, now those who study psychology are naturally attuned to wanting to help. I think it's around recognising that in yourself, but also recognising it from a career perspective on how much of that are you prepared to give to others, and how do you not lose yourself in that too, because that's the other thing that psychologists need to have, which is quite a significant amount of resilience, and that's regardless of the psychology qualification or specialisation they choose, that they can be helping, but also equally that they're not taking all of that home with them every day too, because sometimes that can be a little bit tough.
Do you think if you put yourself in the place, if you would have gone into the traditional path of psychology, do you think you would have been affected by somebody's life story?
Very much so. I'm affected by everyone's life story every day. I love hearing about it. I love meeting new people. I've got genuine curiosity about that. So I think if I was put into an environment where I was maybe not hearing all the good stuff and I was hearing some of the stuff that was proving challenging day in and day out for those individuals, I probably wouldn't be able to separate that out as much, and I would probably find it too overwhelming. And personally, I don't think I'd still be doing it, over 13 years later.
Right. Now, I would love to go to the complete opposite side of it.
Mm-hmm.
Today, your career now spans organizational psychology, and you are a proud owner of Wild Mingo, which is your personal business. Talk me through what a day in your life looks like now.
So I was talking through my morning this morning. My morning this morning consisted of getting up and getting ready for work, getting my toddler up and ready for the day as well with my husband. But also consisted of going through our order list and running our labels for the business for Wild Mingo to make sure that we get all of our orders shipped and dispatched for customers who have ordered online. I also recently had a stand at Big Design Market, so I've spent the last couple of days talking to my end customer, which it doesn't always happen when you have an e-commerce business. Sort of packed all of that up into a bit of a time box and grabbed my stuff to be able to come and have a chat to you. And before I did that, I arrived a little early, sat downstairs in the cafe with my work laptop and booted that up to make sure that I could give a client a call for a piece of work that we're just about to close out, which is a big report looking at all of their people processes. I connected in with some of my team as well. And I started to think about what some of our new BD, so business development and proposal opportunities are that I've got coming up and how I scope those and get some support from our team members to be able to do that as well. So I guess a little bit of compartmentalised time planning. And now I'm getting to chat to you. And then this afternoon I'm going to talk about all sorts of things, operational conversation with our team around how we're managing with, looking at everyone's workload and our recruitment and, some of our internal operational exercises, as well as talking to some of our clients and then a team meeting before the end of the day.
I'm super proud to be talking to you as well. Tell me more about being a business owner. What is it like? What is the curiosity? What was the motivation? And how does it feel today to be a proud owner of your business?
Well, it definitely feels proud. I'm incredibly delighted that we are 5 years old as a business and that Wild Mingo runs not just in Australia but actually globally as well, and that I got to say I built that. Like, that's a really cool thing to be able to say. In terms of, for me and where I got started, it started from an idea. It started in a place of lockdown in 2020 and wanting to save the planet. And it kind of escalated from there and thinking about how I might do that and what that would look like in the context of designing eco-friendly and, good for the planet workout products that were also really beautiful and, crafted from good quality materials as well, with the ability to spotlight amazing female artists. And that's the business as it stands today. But for me, I think the thing that's been most fun is when you start your own thing and when you get to, proudly say you're an entrepreneur, there's no ceiling. There's no that, the only person that stops you from doing something when it's your company and your business is you. And realizing that and coupling that with, I guess, my corporate experience is that there's always a board or an executive layer or a management layer that might stop or prevent something from happening. And maybe that's a block and you can kind of work through it. But there's definitely more ceilings that, you have to navigate through. When you have your own business, you're the ceiling. You're the person who's telling you that you can't do the thing you want to try. So getting out of your own head a little bit and going, well, what would be the worst thing that would happen is a really fun exercise, and actually I think makes me a much better corporate employee because I also don't tend to take no for an answer most of the time in corporate, and so I am known a little bit as a culture disruptor for that reason, but I use that to my advantage in the context of it's not about trying to break every kind of no, then often sometimes they're for good reason, but it's about recognizing when perhaps they're actually not going to drive the right outcome or they're actually going to stifle creativity or potential opportunity as well. And so I get to use that and leverage that from a business perspective. Wild Mingo's taught me a lot about areas I had no idea about. Global supply chain is a good example, how you package a retail product. And I think being able to leverage my psychology, qualification and understanding has been really handy in the context of, I reference color psychology and, we talk about dopamine dressing a little bit. But color is a motivator for movement. Why would people want to pick up a product of mine versus, another product in the market? What do they care about? What does a consumer sort of truly care about? But yeah, have learned so much about areas I didn't expect to have to navigate around how much it costs to ship a pallet to a country, or what happens if somebody wants, 100 units on something turned around, and how quickly can I make that happen? And so really kind of having fun, complex problems to solve on a regular basis. And I think that's the part I always have enjoyed about my jobs and my work as an organisational psychologist. So I get to kind of use that to my advantage in thinking about the business as well.
So the fact that WildMingo and Capgemini Invent are a big part of your identity today, do you think there are some ways psychology still shows up in the work that you do today?
Absolutely. So it shows up in the work that I do every day. So at Capgemini, I am a director in the workforce and organisation practice, and we look after organisational change management, but we actually look after an entire part of our business that's growing area, which is called reinventing work. That's one of the reasons that I joined, was to help drive that strategy and market around looking at what transformation looks like from a workplace and workforce agenda perspective within Australia. And it's something that I've done throughout my career. The nice part is that, there's lots of opportunity and lots of scope. I guess the challenge is I'm the only organisational psychologist in that business right now. And so we are kind of growing and bringing more people into that space and helping our colleagues understand what that means. And our market is starting to understand what that means as well. So I definitely get to apply my skill on a daily basis within the invent side. Coupling that with working within WildMingo, I think it's really nice to be able to talk about those two parts of my life in parallel. And when I was looking at being recruited within Capgemini, it's part of my story. And I think a lot of people who have a side hustle or who do something extra, they tend to hide that part away if they're looking in a corporate role.
Are you able to juggle between the roles properly? I mean, obviously you are, but do you think there are some instances when you feel like, oh my goodness, I'm just getting exhausted, but I have to do it. So how do you drive yourself out of that?
Yeah, I think with the corporate role, that's always going to be the priority because it's your stable income, right? So you're always wanting to make sure that you're preferencing, and particularly in my role, I lead a relatively sizable team, and I have people that rely on me. And because we are a consulting-based business, we're relying on looking at how we build relationships with our clients in market. So there is an element of that takes sort of time and energy. And so sometimes I don't have the time late at night to be able to work on, WildMingo in terms of the business side. It's about recognizing where those things are at, and it's also about not always having to balance everything 50-50 for 100% of the time. Sometimes things are going to take more priority, sometimes things are going to take less, but also equally it's knowing where to invest that energy as well. I think the other thing is, as a business owner, as an entrepreneur, you always have a to-do list. You always feel like you should be doing more. There's always something else. And it's knowing, and this comes with a little bit of professional experience too, but it's knowing when to take a pause for that, because the thing you can't afford to do is run yourself into the ground or burn out, because then there's no one to pick up the pieces. So making sure you recognize what are the big things that have to get done versus where the other areas are that maybe can wait a little bit longer. To your question about how do I motivate myself, I learned early on in my business that I'm the person who has to do that. And, in talking about it with my partner or with my family members or with my friends, they can listen, they can be wonderfully supportive, but they're not the people that necessarily have to do doing. So I have to figure out how to ride that tide when it's really high and everything's going super smoothly and I feel like I'm nailing it, but actually also when it feels a little overwhelming and I'm finding that I might be a little bit more in the drowning territory than I'd like to be, I have to work out where my life raft is and how I pull myself out of that, because no one's going to do it for me. And I think that's a really wonderful reflection compared to just working in a professional career, because I think in a professional environment, you're often looking for somebody else to throw you the life raft and help. And that they do, but actually the reality is you need to figure out where it is for yourself. And so it's been really good to kind of remind me of that too. So that way I can kind of figure out and how I balance both.
So that is actually very good advice of how you manage everything. And this is specifically for the psych students who are listening to us right now. From your own experience, how you have been juggling multiple roles in life and definitely giving your 100%. Where would you tell the psychology students to focus their energy at this time?
A really good question, Jay. I think it's around, prioritizing your studies, understanding what might be ahead of you in terms of professional placement, but also appreciating that you will more than likely need to be working casually or part-time, sometimes full-time, depending on your study load as well. All those things are okay. There's so many different ways and pathways to be able to look at being a registered psychologist. I think we often get into, and I remember, for me as an undergraduate, I was in that race to wanting to finish, wanting to be done with my studies and my degree. That meant that there was times when I was working or I kind of had something on 7 days a week, in terms of a casual job, placement, and then university studies and thesis writing. And it's a lot to have to juggle. So it's also about remembering to kind of have a little bit of fun and be social where you can as well when you are kind of running on a really large load. Study is not forever, and there's some really wonderful luxuries that it affords you that you don't get in professional practice. I will say semester break of extended periods is always a nice time to shut down and reflect and actually properly take a break. But I think, with students who are kind of thinking about how to, manage their time, please focus on what you're studying as your first priority. Even if you're kind of a HEX student, you're spending a lot to be here. So it's important to actually be trying to get a lot out of your degree and thinking about how that then translates into who and where you want to be when you grow up too.
Thank you so much. This is a lot of good advice. And I think I would be the first person in my student life be taking it and applying it to the things that I'm juggling between. All right. This is honestly one of my favorite parts of the episode. We are jumping into the Ask Me Anything segment. So ahead of this episode, we asked you on our Instagram stories, what's on your mind when it comes to careers right now? And right now, I'm in the studio with Candice to unpack those questions without any gatekeeping and just real and honest advice. Candice, a student, has asked us what career pathways exist beyond the traditional clinical route.
So many. Oh my gosh. You can be a educational psychologist working in the school system with children. You can be a developmental psychologist looking at, kids who are, from ages 3 up. You can be a forensic psychologist working often within the criminal system and the legal system. You can be a organisational psychologist, which is what I do. There's also the opportunity for people who have maybe had a partial career of psychology study. Maybe they didn't decide to register as a full psychologist, but they really enjoy the aspects of the human behaviour and the helping people as well. And there's opportunities within that space from a counselling perspective, within a social work perspective. There's so many different angles and avenues to consider, and psychology doesn't have to be a 6-year qualification to be able to be used or thought about within what you do as your career down the track. I mean, if you want to call yourself a psychologist, it does. But, if you want to leverage the great principles and the thinking patterns and the way in which psychology as a thought partner plays out, you can certainly look at that as your undergraduate. And there's also, and the one that I probably haven't mentioned is a lot of people also think about psychology in combination with like a management degree or an HR degree, and then they go and pursue that route as well. So, yeah, so many different options and opportunities.
That is amazing. Another student has asked us, if you're undecided, what's the best way to gain experience while you choose your career?
So I think when you're undecided, it's about being naturally curious and going and exploring really widely, So your career can really take you anywhere, and that can feel overwhelming, but also I reckon it's the most exciting opportunity when you're at that early point in career, because you may not have to end up where you find straight away, and you can take multiple paths to get there. So I think being curious and researching what might be out there, but reflecting first before you research maybe on what you're interested in, what drives you, what motivates you. Maybe like I talked about before, how do you like to think? Do you like solving complex problems? Do you like the answers to be a little bit more black and white? Do you like to be told stuff? Do you want to come up with it? Having a little bit of deeper reflection and thinking about, what you personally enjoy, and then using that to your advantage around researching where you might want to play in terms of your career, and then actually going out and seeing if you can get a coffee conversation with somebody, go and get some experience somewhere. If what drives you is being able to work within a clinical psychology practice, go and look up a couple of clinical practices near home and give them a call, and ask them a little bit about their experience, or see if you can set up a meeting to talk to the either the office admin, or whether they'll link you up with one of the kind of head psychs for a coffee. People are usually pretty comfortable to give 30 minutes of their time up for somebody who is a student and figuring out where they want to go with their career. And you could apply that to any industry, any example. So particularly if it's a job you haven't really seen before, go and figure out how you get yourself exposure to that rather than just thinking about it.
Thank you so much. And this almost takes us to the end. To finish us up, I would love to ask you for a recommendation to leave with us today. Something that has helped you in your career or mindset lately.
If I had to reflect on, something within professional world that I've sort of been thinking about lately, it's probably how you take a step away from feeling like you need to constantly be on and networking and putting on a particular professional presence, and actually how you just can be curious and get to know the people that are sitting in front of you and that you're chatting to. I was asked a question the other day about my presence and how I show up, and people were sort of trying to understand it because they wanted to replicate it. And we had a really good conversation about how I don't want anybody to replicate my presence. I want them to come up with what their presence needs to be and what their brand needs to be. And so I think the thing that I'm trying to embody also is that I don't think anyone should try to be like anyone else. You might grab bits and elements of what you like, but actually really thinking about who you are and being curious about that person sitting in front of you and what they can add and what they can bring, rather than always focusing in on what you are or what you can bring into that conversation. So I'm really trying to take that opportunity to sit back a little bit, I guess, or be a little quieter. I'm a naturally extroverted person, so I can often be the first one to jump in. And I'm really trying to practice, how do I create more and more space for different voices, different perspectives, and different ideas to really come to the fold to make us all better.
That is a lovely recommendation. It was honestly very meaningful advice that you've given. But thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate you taking time out for this.
Thank you, Jay. It was an absolute privilege to be able to talk to you and to talk to all your students too.
And that's a wrap. Hopefully, this has given you some new career inspiration and reminded you that you can do so much with your psychology degree. If you got something out of this, share it with a friend who may need it. And do not forget to refer to the show notes that will link you through to My Deakin Talent. And it is a goodbye for now, but not forever. And I shall see you in the next one. Bye-bye.